Trump revealed the letter's existence during an early March interview with Fox Business News, saying, "I've written them a letter saying, I hope you're going to negotiate, because if we have to go in militarily, it's going to be a terrible thing." He added, "You can't let them have a nuclear weapon." Iran's supreme leader dismissed the letter as deceptive, but Foreign Minister Araghchi confirmed that Tehran is still evaluating its response, which is expected in the coming days.
The letter is actually more of a threat, but it also claims that there are opportunities.
In his first term, Trump withdrew the U.S. from the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran, which had placed strict limits on Tehran's nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. After pulling out in 2018 and reimposing sanctions, Iran breached and far surpassed those limits, advancing its nuclear program.
And we want to turn now to our dearest Camille Yanti-Kabifard, the brilliant editor-in-chief of the Independent Persian. Thank you so very much, Yanti-Kabifard, for your time. And before we begin our conversation, would like to say Happy Nowruz, right? From everyone here at I-24 News, would like to wish you a happy Persian New Year. That's the future we want to see here in the region.
Thank you, dearest Ellie, and I'm so grateful for the Nowruz greeting. I wish the spring brings everyone joy, prosperity, and good health, especially the Iranians, and will be considered as the year of their freedom. Amen.
Amen. May we celebrate Nowruz and Passover soon at the same time together. Well, unfortunately, until we get there, we need to get to our daily affairs. So we know President Trump has this different take on how to handle diplomatic business, let's put it that way. But are the Iranians talking the talk and walking this walk? Is the regime in Tehran seeing this as a demonstration of American strength or weakness?
It would be an absolutely one of the crucial and important year for the Islamic Republic and for the Iranian people. As we heard from the Axios, the letter has been given only 2 months deadline to the regime to respond back to President Trump. And it was an important remarks by Araghchi today when he mentioned not about the content of the letter, which he said it has opportunities and some threats, and also during his New Year messages delivering to the people says we would having a difficult and important year ahead. Even that has been reflected on Khamenei and Pezeshkian New Year messages today. Both they consider this year would be an important, and the year has been passed was full of challenges. These challenges, they were confronting. One of them is President Trump's deadline about Iran nuclear facilities and a talk and the negotiation with them. The other challenge is the Iranians. We saw that in the past 2 days ago, as you saw that, Iranian astonishingly gathered at the street to celebrate Nowruz and other events on Tuesday evening that called Charshanbe Suri, as an absolute confrontation with the regime. We know that now is the month of Ramadan and the regime restricted people to observe this holy month, but seeing Iranian like that at the street and chanting regime changes and calling for Pahlavi to come back, there would be a very big challenges for them, putting President Trump's letter and the Iranian at the other side. We could say the big changes is coming to Iran this year.
So speaking of those changes, perhaps putting the spotlight more on the Western side of things, because the Islamic Republic, meanwhile, benefiting out of this turmoil elsewhere, we'll call it that way, advancing its nuclear program. What should the West do next? And is there still a cohesive West here when it comes to the policy vis-a-vis Iran? Or is Iran playing, Europe and the U.S. in two different tones at the same time?
As much as President Trump has been given up by the European powers, which you call the West, Iranian also has been giving up to have any trust on them. Today, President Trump is very popular in Iran, among of the Iranian outside Iran. he is keen and he is honest about what is on the table, and there is no back channel like Biden and the Democrat administrations. That doesn't mean he wants to enter to a war with Iran and the Iranians. What is on the table is squeezing the Islamic Republic. And here, this in the increasing enrichment in the level of the 60%, all of this holding them back to not negotiating on it, it can be only the reason for, and this is the tools the regime has to play, and is the card to play a game with the US, with everyone. And if they want to give up this program, if they want to completely halt this program, there would be nothing else for them. They can negotiate, they can make excuses for all the trouble making in the region, and also they would challenge them internally in front of their own supporters who they are demanding no talks with the US. These things is more to be realistic for them, to holding it as a reason to benefit Iranian people, is to use it as a tools to avoid changing themselves and negotiate with war.
Right, so the foreign policy is nourished by the interior policy and vice versa, right? Camille Yanti-Kabifart, editor-in-chief, The Independent Persian. I will go back to the beginning of our conversation and wish us all to celebrate Nowruz and Passover soon enough at the same time together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and happy Passover to you and your viewers too.
Thank you, Ms. Yanti-Kabifart. Thank you. Yes, well, we can wish, right?
Well, I mean, it's great to see these representatives of the free Iran and of the Iranian opposition reflect the fact that the Jewish people, the Israeli people, and Iran and the Iranian people have no actual enmity that is needed or that is natural.
On the contrary, the periphery policy of Ben-Gurion when Israel was established was teaming up with Iran, Turkey, and Ethiopia, right?
It's easy to forget, but it was only 45 years ago. Here's the thing, though. This letter to the Iranians is very, very meaningful because throughout the negotiation, the long-winded and interminable negotiation that led to the accord a decade ago, Iran benefited from a fundamental asymmetry. They had the leverage that came from the constant threat that they're approaching a nuclear weapon. The West, unfortunately, under the Democratic administration, didn't have leverage because they never actually threatened military action. If you look carefully at this letter, it dismantles both aspects. They're given a deadline, no more permanent negotiations, and B, they're more than suggesting that military action is not off the table.
Yeah. Ultimatums, name of the game here.
I think this is all very true, and let's keep in mind that the U.S. arms supplies to Israel, including some heavy bombs, is continuous. So I think Trump is quite happy to also use Israel as a kind of stick to say that to the Iranian regime, look, if you don't comply, I'm going to give Israel the green light to attack, perhaps with U.S. involvement, perhaps without. We saw some very interesting military posturing through the form of exercises in recent weeks. U.S. Air Force training with the Israeli Air Force, B-52, flying with Israeli F-35s and other jets. So, you know, there are a lot of, I think, messages, very clear messages being sent to the Iranians. But I'll just say one more thing. Yeah. The longer-term problem here, you know, we've always been dealing with two clocks. One is when will the Iranians go nuclear? The second is how long will the Iranian regime survive for?
Right.
We know the dial on the nuclear clock more or less, or at least we hope we know. But nobody knows when the nuclear regime, and that's the clock that really matters the most, because once that regime falls, assuming a more moderate Iranian leadership takes its place.
So again, this correlation between foreign policy and domestic policy. And on that note, Mr. Dan Perry, Mr. Yaakov Lapin, thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us and letting us get a better idea of the world we live in. Thank you very much, and try to disagree next time. On to this now, a hostage release deal brokered by the Qataris. Yes, an American man who was abducted more than 2 years ago while traveling through Afghanistan as a tourist, been released by the Taliban in a deal with the Trump administration. George Gleasman, an airline mechanic from Atlanta, was seized by the Taliban back in December 2022, the third American detainee to be released by the Taliban since the beginning of 2025. On to this now. Mass protests have erupted in Turkey after authorities detained the mayor of Istanbul just days before he was due to be selected as presidential candidate. Police detained many others, including other politicians, journalists, and businessmen as part of this investigation. And the Istanbul governor's office has imposed 4 days of restrictions in the city. Here's more.
It is not just Ekrem İmamoğlu who was detained this morning. It is the will of Istanbul, with a population of 16 million who was detained this morning. If we accept it, democracy dies. The day the government determines its rivals is the day our democracy dies.
Ekrem İmamoğlu, the mayor of Istanbul and the main rival of President Tayyip Erdogan, was detained Wednesday on charges of corruption and aiding a terrorist group. A construction company co-owned by İmamoğlu was also seized based on a financial crime investigation. 37 others were detained as well for allegedly making provocative posts inciting crime and hatred over the mayor's detention. Tens of thousands gathered in Istanbul's Saraçhane district on Wednesday as Turkey's main opposition party condemned the arrest of Istanbul's mayor, calling it, quote, a coup against our next president.
Tayyip Erdogan is trying to break Ekrem İmamoğlu's wrists with the stick of the judiciary because he has lost all 4 elections in which he entered with him.
And several hundred students clashed with police in Ankara Wednesday night as they protested the detention of İmamoğlu.
The mayor of Istanbul is the second most important elected post in Turkey after the presidential office. And what has happened has the potential and will have the potential to upend the whole political picture in the country, the relation between the opposition and government.
The move against the popular two-term mayor caps a months-long legal crackdown on opposition figures across the country, which has been criticized as a politicized attempt to hurt their electoral prospects and silence dissent.
The people will respond again. As you saw yesterday, everyone is on the streets. Everyone is on the squares. The squares and the ballot box is what will come out of this. I say the righteous one will win.
On to this now. Russian President Vladimir Putin is no longer sending hints or mild messages. He is all out with his intention to regain his grip in Syria. Zero regrets vis-a-vis his old ally, al-Assad, reaching out ahead to Syrian leader Ahmed al-Shara. We want to turn now for more insight to Anna Borshevskaya, senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Thank you very much, Ms. Borshevskaya, for your time. I will ask that simply. What is it that Putin is offering the new Syrian leader? What is it that he might want from Putin?
Thanks very much for having me. It's always good to be on your show.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, publicly, Putin did not say, of course, what he's offering, but likely what he is offering is most likely international recognition along with economic cooperation. And the fact of the matter is, these 2 points highlight the fact that Russia still has quite a bit of influence in Syria. As you said, of course, Russia is trying to win this influence back. They're certainly down, but they still have a number of cards to play, and they're not out.
So we're seeing more indications. This new regime is not really offering a new way. We'll put it that way. So a change of heart is nowhere to be found, merely swapping seats to an extent. So what are we expected to see in this respect when Putin is now getting in the game?
Well, I think one thing we could see is Russia positioning itself as a sort of a security provider, as a protector of minorities. And that's a traditional card Russia played in the region. Particularly, we saw that after the Arab Spring, overall across the Middle East, but also specifically in Syria as well. So you're going to see Russia positioning itself again as sort of a stable anchor, if you will. And again, that is a role that Russia played in Syria in the past under Bashar al-Assad. It tried to position itself as a mediator. Remember that Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council. So from Shara's perspective, Russia is still important too.
So what is the status regarding the Russian bases in Syria? We saw them sheltering Alawites escaping massacres by government forces. Will they stay?
Well, one thing that was reported, which is quite interesting, is that quite a number of people, perhaps 8,000 or 9,000, if reports are accurate, have taken refuge in the Russian airbase Khmeimim. And Russia's foreign ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova made a number of comments to that, highlighting this point. So I think again that brings us to the sort of what role could Russia play? Well, it could try to position itself as somebody who brings some sort of security, some sort of stability. And to your question about Russia's bases, where did they play? Russia, of course, wants to keep its bases, and the fact of the matter is. What the current government has done is they never really canceled the Russian contract. They simply allowed the existing one to lapse. So what could happen is one potential outcome is we could simply see another reason why Russian military bases need to stay.
So if we're zooming out before we conclude our conversation, what other superpowers are wooing this new regime there? What could pose as a quote unquote threat to Putin's plan?
I'd say as of now, Turkey is Russia's biggest competitor. So Turkey has already outmaneuvered Russia in Syria, and that's pretty clear. But I think looking further down the road, perhaps Saudi Arabia would be another actor. And of course, the other big question is what will the United States do in Syria? What is our policy, right? What is the fate of American troops? From the Russian perspective, of course, Russia would want to see America leave. And lastly, of course, is Iran. Iran is also trying to find its way back.
So in terms of, if you'll have to perhaps give a bottom line, if you will, an unfair question here to the current Russian policy in this changing Middle East, what would it be?
Russia is as pragmatic as ever, and still has a lot of cards to play in the context of the fact that the West is often too slow to the game. So speed really matters here.
Anna Vershevskaya, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Always a pleasure listening to you. Thank you so very much for joining us. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And just circling back to the breaking news this past hour, yet another Houthi missile was launched from Yemen towards the area of Jerusalem and Israel. The missile was intercepted before crossing into Israeli skies to prevent the debris from falling on the ground. Obviously, another ramification of such launches. We are done for the night, but right after us, David Matlin with the rundown will continue to bring you all the latest update. Thank you very much for watching. Hopefully it will be a peaceful, quiet night. Thank you.
Want to stay on top of the news no matter where you are? Introducing i24 News' brand new news website. On our website, you'll find all the latest articles, interviews, and live broadcasts. Everything you need to know right at your fingertips, whenever you want it. So what are you waiting for? Download the i24 News app today.
How do you get your news? How do you know what sources to trust? And to paint a clear picture of the entire story, you need a breakdown of the constant stream of events, top stories, expert analysts, and the best journalists bringing you real voices on the ground. We're breaking it all down on The Rundown. Get the facts, stay informed, and be a voice of reason for the Middle East.
Introducing the brand new i24 News Video On Demand app. You'll have instant access to all our programs, reports, in-depth discussions, and expert commentaries, all at your fingertips, whenever you want it. So what are you waiting for? Download the i24 News Video On Demand app today.
sido pacífico.
The Israel Defense Force deepens the ground offensive into Gaza, with troops moving in from multiple directions, while the first rocket fire out of the Strip in nearly 6 months targets central Israel. An incoming ballistic missile from Yemen was intercepted this hour. That's after another came at 4 a.m., sending most of central Israel into shelters as the U.S. military continues to target the Houthi regime. And Gazan captivity survivor Eli Sharabi continues his international efforts, addressing the UN Security Council today with heavy and accusatory testimony. We'll take a look at the impact. Hello, welcome to I-24 News and the Rundown here. I'm David Matlin, coming to you live from Tel Aviv. Thanks for joining us. A lot to cover today. In just this hour, rocket and missile fire again is returned to terrorize Israelis. A large swath of central Israel was rudely awakened. I'll take you back to 4 a.m. That was from ballistic missile fire from Yemen. And then today, just after 1 p.m., 3 rockets were fired from the central Gaza Strip at central Israel. Now, in both cases and this last hour, the projectiles were intercepted by Israeli defenses. There were no injuries or serious damage, but the attacks highlight the fact that we are back in open conflict here, back at war. And as we speak, soldiers of the Israel Defense Force are moving into strategic areas of Gaza on the ground, tanks leading the charge once again, supported by airstrikes and other measures. Now, the new offensive appears to be widening, which is where we begin this evening with our correspondent Robert Swift. He's down there in southern Israel. Rob, what about the latest reports from the offensive? The IDF, I believe, is saying that over 900 terror operatives have been killed in the last 2 days as heavy maneuvers south, central, and north Gaza. The head of the Hamas General Security Forces taken out in a targeted strike. What does this campaign come to look like as of now, as of today?
Yeah, the IDF does seem to be gearing up to insert into several areas within Gaza. Just as we were standing here waiting for you to come to us, I just saw 2 Merkava tanks being transported on the back of lorries close to where we are. That looks like further armour being placed ready to enter the Gaza Strip. As you've mentioned, the IDF is inserting by land into the Gaza Strip. We've seen reports from the IDF saying that in the far north of the Gaza Strip, in Beit Lahia, close to the coastal route there, the IDF have begun some form of of ground incursion there. We ourselves saw firsthand that airstrikes have taken place there. The IDF have said that airstrikes are taking place throughout the entirety of the Gaza Strip, but we saw in the north of Gaza, close to Beit Lahia, airstrikes going in. Further south within the strip, in the Netzarim corridor, the IDF is expanding its control of that artery. This dissecting between Israeli territory and the coastal line. It's essentially cutting the Gaza Strip in half. The IDF is moving along there towards the coastline as we speak. And of course, further south, from the area where the rockets that were fired around noon this earlier towards Tel Aviv, from that area in the south, in Bani Sulhan, the IDF has issued an evacuation order there. So possible sign of future IDF activity there, perhaps just in the form of airstrikes at this point. Now, Israel's Defense Minister, Israel Katz, has, in a meeting with the Chief of Staff, Eyal Zamir, earlier today, he said, "We already see that the military pressure affects Hamas's position. We will not stop until the hostages are released." Now, this takes place, all these airstrikes and the increasing ground operations take place as obviously some in Israel are concerned about the impact that these actions will have on the hostages that still remain inside the Gaza Strip. The Hostages Families Forum earlier today said the families of the hostages are anxious about the expansion of ground operations and attacks in the Gaza Strip. This decision consciously endangers the hostages, as the survivors of captivity have previously testified. So at the moment we see that the IDF does appear to be gearing up. A string of names, mostly from Hamas but also from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, have been announced as targets that have been eliminated by the IDF. As the hours of darkness continue tonight, that's likely to continue.
Well, stay tuned. Bring it all to our viewers as it occurs. Here, Robert Swift coming to us from the border region by the Gaza Strip. Thanks for the updates. And bring the discussion into the studio here now, joined by security analyst Yaakov Lapin with us tonight, and Ariel Osaran, I-24 News Middle East correspondent. Yaakov, coming to you first on this, and Robert brought this up. Defense Minister Katz, paraphrase essentially to Gazans, that return all the hostages, reject Hamas, or it's over for you. Is that the equation now? How far will the IDF go? Is this slated, from what we can tell, to be the last major invasion of Gaza?
I think that this is definitely a very different phase of the war. Israel's message to Hamas's leadership, to Mohammed Sinwar and his inner circle is, look, if you continue to entrench yourself in this position of saying no to the Witkoff offer, no to releasing significant numbers of living hostages, this ground incursion is going to expand. More and more of Gaza will come under direct Israeli military control. My guess would be that unlike past months of conflict, places that the IDF now goes into, it is not going to be quickly coming back out. The in-and-out raid model, I think, is going to be relegated to the past. And so we'll have more and more civilians being pushed to the Al-Mawasi humanitarian area, and the pressure on Hamas will grow. Now, how will Hamas respond to that? We don't know. We don't know. We cannot get into the head of jihadists. I think that's a central lesson of October 7th. They have the option to press pause by releasing hostages. That option has been made very clear to them. And now we will see how this will play out. But I think Israel's position is crystal clear, and it has total support from the White House for this new phase of the war.
And speaking of the White House here, Ariel, there's a lot taking place around the region, clearly. But with just this Gaza situation flaring up right now, we can get into other fronts as we go. The U.S. reportedly sending reinforcements, military assets to the region. What does that look like, essentially? What's the U.S. doing?
Right. So this isn't an official statement by the Pentagon, but a U.S. official, unnamed U.S. official, spoke with Qatari Al Jazeera earlier today, said that the U.S. is bolstering its forces in the Middle East, in the region, sending reinforcements that are expected to begin to arrive within the next couple of weeks. Didn't really specify what this includes, except that these reinforcements will include air defenses. That is a clear sign as to what the U.S. expects to be challenges moving forward. The U.S. official did say that regarding the strikes on the Houthis, that since Saturday the U.S. struck 60 targets. Today, this was before the U.S. renewed its strikes on Hodeidah in West Yemen and in Saada just in the past few minutes in northwest of Yemen. The strikes included targeting Houthi engineers, operators, and officials associated with the Houthis' drone program. And this unnamed official vowed that the operations against the Houthis will continue as long or until the Houthis stop targeting their ships and shipping routes in the region. I will just note that at the same time, Syrian media is reporting that 2 cargo planes of the U.S. military arrived in American military installation in northeast Syria, including military and logistical gear, but also troops, part of the U.S. really reinforcing its presence in the region.
This is a region that during the previous Trump administration, there had been real concern that it would be completely evacuated or pulled out of Syria at this point. Interesting to see somewhat of the opposite taking place right now. You mentioned the Houthis. We got to jump into that, gentlemen, as well. The latest reports claim that airstrikes are hitting the Hodeidah port area, the east of Yemen. Not sure exactly what assets, but hitting assets belonging to the Houthi regime there. And with the resumption of an Israeli offensive in Gaza this week, the Houthis in Yemen, under their national slogan banner of death to Israel, death to America, curse on the Jews. Well, they went right back to targeting Israeli population centers, international cargo ships, and, of course, those U.S. warships trying to protect the shipping lanes. And that most recent missile coming just this last hour, right before we came on air here, sending huge portions of central Israel again into the shelters. That was intercepted as well. So we still have both of you in the studio with us here. Jakob, the Houthi front. Look, the latest activity on this front. We know the U.S. has been active, I think, for 6 straight days, as we were just saying here. Where does this? How does this appear to be being managed by Israel? We would think would jump into the fray and maybe striking back at Yemen right now. Is this solely up to the U.S.? Does it look like at this point?
It looks like they've allocated their roles, ahead of time, and it looks like the U.S. has told Israel, "Leave the Houthis to us. You go ahead and deal with Hamas." That looks like what the situation is on the ground, because the U.S. has more than what is necessary to deal with the Houthis. The problem with the Houthis is that they are spread out. They're an asymmetric terror army, the kind of foe that we're used to seeing, but not in a small area like the Gaza Strip, but in a much larger spread out space in the deep deserts of Yemen, in the mountains and caves. This is an enemy that is going to take time to remove their capabilities. And as long as that's the U.S. goal, then I think this is going to be very positive. Hopefully, we're not going to be seeing, attempts to deter, quote unquote, the Houthis, because it looks like they cannot be deterred, much like their fellow jihadis elsewhere. So I think the goal here is to take away their missile launch capabilities, to force their leadership underground, to keep them in a state of being hunted, rather than being the ones who not only are firing on Israel, but also disrupting the whole of international trade and shipping and the region and the economies of Egypt and Jordan. So the U.S. looks like it's in this for the long haul, and this, I think, is very encouraging for the region. We need a little bit of patience, and we need to let the Americans work.
In terms of the U.S. role, Ariel, there's a new tone, or at least a key element that I think the Trump administration is bringing in here, that they're looking beyond Yemen and the Houthis at this point, taking the issue and pressure to Iran, which is something I think a lot of us have wanted to see for a long time. What does that look like? What cost might the U.S. be looking to exact on Iran for Houthi activity?
Well, President Trump said himself that any strike on U.S. forces by the Houthis will be seen as a strike by Iran proper, given the fact that it's the Iranians who are supporting the Houthis with money, weapons, and know-how. And so there are those who believe that what we're seeing now in Yemen is a prelude or even a pretext to potential U.S. airstrikes on Iran, targeting the nuclear program. Obviously, it's important not to get ahead of ourselves.
I don't know if we confirm this, but there's a report that the U.S. targeted like an Iranian intelligence ship that may have been coordinating for the Houthis. We don't know if that's confirmed or not, but these are the type of assets that they may be going after.
Yeah, that has not been confirmed. There are so many reports going either way on these days, and we really need to be cautious and make sure that what we report is verifiable, but it's just an indication as to the tensions. What we can say is that the Iranian Air Force said one of its jets and a drone repelled U.S. reconnaissance drone off the coast of Iran, southwest Iran. All this really indicating heightened tensions, and when you couple that with the reported letter that U.S. President Trump sent to Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, which was described as a harsh letter giving pretty much a 2-month deadline for talks. It's not clear if it's 2 months from the moment that the letter was delivered, or 2 months from when the talks begin. We are entering a period of heightened tension at the highest level between the United States and Iran. No more proxies, even though they're still engaged. This is really a direct collision course between Washington and Tehran. And what we're seeing right now are the various chess pieces moving along the board, being repositioned.
Serious pieces. We'll touch more on Iran in a moment. I want to bring in another element, talking about the U.S. here. And our senior U.S. correspondent, Mike Wagenheim, he went to the State Department for a press conference that addressed the shifting situations in the Middle East, put it that way, where he got some insight on the U.S. perspective.
While the Trump administration and the Netanyahu government were coordinated on Israel's airstrikes on Hamas earlier this week, there's no doubt the White House will want to play a role in trying to re-implement a ceasefire going forward. The big questions are, number one, how much political capital will the White House extend on trying to get a deal done yet again? Will it be as much as the first time around? And secondly, what will be the game plan? Will it be again to pressure Jerusalem, or will it be to apply more leverage on Qatar to clamp down on Hamas?
President Trump is not just wanting a peaceful day or a peaceful week. Secretary Rubio is not flying around to speak with his counterparts, to handle summits and speaking with the parties involved so that we can have a peaceful fortnight. This is over. It is over. The people, all of us are subjected, certainly not as much as the people on the ground in the Middle East. But the world has to be done with this situation. So the commitment, we would, with the nature of what President Trump has already been able to create in his first term, in his personal life, the nature of the commitment of Secretary Rubio, that we have got an understanding of enough of a history of knowing what has happened, that we know it has to be handled differently. The region understands this, and the Trump administration we have this window of this administration to change the trajectory of what has been decades and decades, coming up on 100 years of carnage that is now unacceptable. So if it's going to be done, everything that is necessary to get it done will be delivered by President Trump.
The U.S. faults Hamas for not accepting the so-called bridge proposal of U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, which would have allowed for more hostages and security prisoners to be released as an extension of Phase 1 of the ceasefire, which would have entailed more negotiations on Phase 2. The question now, is that offer still on the table?
Knowing the envoys, the special envoys that we have, it's not that anything is off the table. It is about adhering to what the bridge would be and would have been, and that is something that can still happen. So that's what we hope for. It's why we do this, right? It's wanting to have that and to try to forestall saying no and going back to the old dynamic. So when you've worked hard on an issue and it's a proposal that's been made, that certainly is something that can be revisited.
Meanwhile, a report emerging this morning that Egypt is offering its own compromise proposal. It would be somewhere in between Cairo's previous proposal, which would see the release of all remaining American hostages, both living and dead, and the Witkoff proposal, which would see the release of half of the remaining living and dead hostages being held by Hamas. Reporting here from the State Department, Mike Wagenheim, I-24 News.
As if we didn't have enough fronts to focus on right now, we have to look at Lebanon right now. Strikes are being reported in southern Lebanon. Ariel, what's being reported out of this arena that's been so quiet?
Yeah, Lebanese media reporting a series of Israeli airstrikes in the Klima Tufah area. It's in southern Lebanon, but north of the Litani River. We've been seeing more and more of these strikes.
This is tonight,
north.
As we're speaking,
As we're speaking, as well as in Shamshtar in the northeast part of the Bekaa Valley near the border with Syria. These strikes have been going on a nearly daily basis. And just to give our viewers a clear understanding as where we are now, the ceasefire is pretty much ended on Saturday with Israel resuming strikes on Gaza. And now we are basically in 5 active fronts. There's against Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, they're firing at Israel. Israel is carrying out strikes in Lebanon on a daily basis, in Syria on a near daily basis. And obviously we can't forget the most active front that gets pushed to the sidelines is the West Bank. Israeli forces operating at any given moment in between 2 and 4 different areas in the West Bank, Southwest Bank, Northwest Bank. And so you can say that the multi-front war is gearing up once again. Israel finds itself engaged in multiple fronts. However, regarding the deployment of ground forces, they are focused, obviously, as they have been since October 7th and even prior to that in the West Bank. But regarding the Gaza Strip, no longer is there the diversion of forces. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, former Defense Minister Gallant, said that at the height of the fighting in Lebanon, 60% of IDF ground forces were operating in Lebanon. That is not the case right now, allowing a lot more flexibility and freedom of operation in the eyes of Israel with regards to Gaza.
Good summary of the active 5 fronts around us. Hard to keep up with them all in the short time we have on air. Yaakov, bringing the U.S. into this, as we just heard from Mike in the State Department here. Look, the Biden administration's support for the Israeli war effort in Gaza and Lebanon may be summarized as a series of red lights, don'ts, quote unquote, to Israel along the way with this campaign, which we don't expect right now from Trump, unless I'm wrong. Are we likely to see a $500 million aid pier built on the Gaza Strip, for example, or pressure to supply the enemy while we're fighting them, or any of these things that we experienced while we dealt with the Biden administration? What's coming first now with Trump?
Well, it looks like Israel has a total green light to do what it is doing in the Gaza Strip. This is a very big change. I mean, it started with the aid trucks that were frozen a number of weeks ago, which would have been impossible to even imagine under the Biden administration. By the way, this is a direct blow to Hamas's political regime because they were hijacking that aid and using it to signal to Gazans that they are still the regime. Now that has stopped. And then we saw the first minutes of the airstrikes, the Israeli airstrikes a few days ago. Who did they target? The internal Hamas political regime and security forces, those commanders. So there's a signal here being sent that Hamas, not only its terror army is going to be hit, but also its regime. And more generally, just zooming out, I would quickly say that the Iranian ring of fire that it has spent billions building around Israel, most of that ring, most of that chokehold has been dismantled. And what we've got left is Hamas in the Gaza Strip, remnants of Houthi capabilities, and Iran itself. This is a completely different situation than what we were dealing with a year and a half ago.
Tens of billions of dollars down the
drain
for all that.
Exactly.
Yaakov, Ariel, stay with us. More to come, though. Now, the Israeli government is set to vote this evening, very soon, to oust the head of the Shin Bet, Ronen Bar, marking the first time an Israeli intel chief would be forced from office ever. Now, the vote's been scheduled despite nationwide demonstrations against it, protests of the Attorney General, even outrage from Gaza hostage families. His issue was on the docket, apparently deprioritized and rescheduled to pave the way for Bar's ouster. Now, this hour again, protests are underway in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem. That's where we take you now. Our correspondent Blair Sladin braving the bad weather out there this evening. And look, what do the demonstrations look like? They've been fairly large scale since yesterday, despite the weather. Characterized, though, I'd argue, by police water cannons, lots of shoving, even a parliamentary leader of the left, Yair Golan, thrown to the ground by police on camera. Look, what's happening now in the streets and with the vote?
Yes, intense clashes between the police and the protesters here throughout this day, including what you have mentioned, pushing Yair Golan, one of the heads of the opposition in Israel, to the ground. And later on, he posted about this. He said that he's fine and he will continue with, quote unquote, his fight for the democracy of Israel. There were in front of the Prime Minister's residence only, I would say, dozens of people, not more, because of the weather, could be. And also here, we're not very far away. We can't actually get closer for now because there is no coverage there over our heads. But I have seen a few hundred people with their umbrellas going to the place where this vote is set to be taken, close to the Knesset, to the government's offices. And of course, in a few hours, there will be a meeting in this government to vote and to oust, as you've said, the head of the Shin Bet, Shabak, Ronen Bar. And this is something that the protesters here see as undemocratic. They are saying that he is one of the people that protects the democracy of Israel. They are mentioning, of course, the fact that the Shin Bet is now investigating actually people that are close or in the circle of the Prime Minister of Israel, people that they suspect that they have some connection to the state of Qatar, a state that, of course, very controversial here in Israel. And they are saying that because of this investigation, now the Prime Minister is firing the head of the Shin Bet. So we see that there is a lot of outrage among these protesters against the government. We should just mention that these people also protested during this war and before this war over the judicial overhaul reforms, and of course even before that on many topics before. So we're talking about opposition groups that are anti this government. They are aligned, of course, with the center-left in Israel, and hundreds, at least for now, are here in front of the Knesset, in front of the government's offices, in order to protest as well this ousting of the head of the Shin Bet.
And Belito, I know you were out there just now during the air raid alert sirens from that missile from Yemen. I know, so you and others hustling for shelter as you're covering this story. A lot going on in and around the country. Belito Sladim, thanks for being with us from Jerusalem. Again, as this vote is underway to oust the head of the Shin Bet. Now, just to get into the subject, Yaakov, perhaps here, we're going to talk about Qatar a lot in the next segment when we come back from the break. But intriguing move by Netanyahu, just to get your thoughts before we go out to break here. Trying to oust, the Shin Bet head right now. He's an easy target, I would argue, because the public sees him as responsible for the failures of October 7th as Shin Bet chief, and rightfully so. But that's not the reason given by the Prime Minister right now for ousting him. I think that would draw attention to his own culpability in October 7th. He's talking more about a lack of trust, a sort of breakdown in trust. What are we left to understand is going on in the situation that led to this unprecedented move to throw out the Shin Bet chief?
I think, it's clear we have a really bad breakdown, mutual breakdown of trust between the political echelon, Prime Minister Netanyahu, government, and the head of Israel's critical domestic intelligence agency, which day in and day out, what it is doing, behind the scenes is saving lives every single day, preventing hundreds of terror attacks. And that's the proper, framework, I think, that the Shin Bet should be discussed. So just the fact that the words Shin Bet and politics have now become intertwined is bad, is dangerous. And I think everybody involved has got to find a way to start moving back from the brink, because we only have one country, we only have one Shin Bet, we only have one government. This is not going to be the way to resolve the differences. There's absolutely no problem for differences to occur. It's completely legitimate, but I think for the sake of security and a minimal level of cohesion, there are going to have to be better ways for the civilian government, and in this case, the Shin Bet and other security organizations, to manage their differences. I would leave it at that, I think.
Test after test, rolling through this country, the public, the government. Not a dull moment, never is. Yaakov Lapin, Ariel Osran. Stay with us, gentlemen. We are stepping out, though. We'll be right back after a short break here on The Rundown. Live here in Tel Aviv. We'll be right back with all the top stories in and around Israel. Look at the UN Security Council as well. Stay with us.
עם ישראל חי, עם Now, more than ever, we are all joining forces at the front lines and the home front in medicine, technology, research and development with hope. And together strengthen the Negev. Ben-Gurion University, the University of the Negev.
Dance, music, and magic immerse you in the story of Jerusalem. This is Jerusalem, an unforgettable musical where the past and present meet. Welcome to the heart of the most sought-after city in the world. A unique experience only at Kikar HaMusika. Reserve now at thisisjerusalem.co.il.
Introducing the brand new i24 News Video On Demand app. You'll have instant access to all our programs, reports, in-depth discussions and expert commentary, all at your fingertips, whenever you want it. So what are you waiting for? Download the i24 News Video On Demand app today. The 7th of October set in motion a chain of events. Today, Israel's enemies are severely weakened, but not defeated, and the balance of power is shifting. This region never rests. And for its own survival, Israel needs to keep its finger on the pulse. If you want to better understand, if you want to hear voices you won't hear elsewhere, then tune in daily to Middle East Now on i24 News.
Welcome back to The Rundown. Thanks for staying with us. Continuing live here this hour from Tel Aviv. Now, Israeli Gazan captivity survivor Eli Sharabi. He spoke before the UN Security Council today in moving, in accusatory language that, well, he brought the harrowing plight of the hostages directly to those envoys sitting at the round table. Sharabi emerged from more than a year in grueling captivity recently, only to find out that his wife and daughter had been murdered in the October 7th rampage. But despite that, he's taken on the burden of speaking for his people in many international forums, displaying a fortitude few of us can even imagine. Now here, though, taking some of what Sharabi told the Security Council today.
For the first 52 days, I was held in an apartment. I was tied up with ropes. My arms and legs were tied so tightly, the ropes tore into my flesh. I was given almost no food, no water, and I couldn't sleep. The pain was unbearable. Sometimes I would just faint from the pain, only to wake up to that pain again and again. Then, on November 27, 2023, Hamas took me into a tunnel, 50 meters underground. Again, the chains were so tight, they ripped my skin. They never took them off, not for a single moment. Those chains tore at me until the day I was released. Every step I took was no more than 10 centimeters. Every walk to the bathroom took an eternity. I cannot begin to describe the agony. It was hell. I was fed a piece of pita a day, maybe a sip of tea. Hunger consumed everything. On February 8, 2025, I was released. I weighed 44 kilograms. This is less than the body weight of my youngest daughter, Yahel. May her memory be blessed. I stood at that sick Hamas ceremony, surrounded by terrorists and the crowd, of so-called uninvolved civilians, hoping my wife and daughters were waiting for me. At the handover, I met a representative from the Red Cross. She told me, "Don't worry, you are safe now." Safe? How could I feel safe surrounded by terrorist monsters? Where had the Red Cross been for the past 491 days? Then I arrived home. They told me my mother and sister were waiting for me. I said, "Get me my wife and daughters." And that was when I knew. They were gone. They had been murdered. I know that you discuss the humanitarian situation in Gaza very often. But let me tell you, as an eyewitness, I saw what happened to that aid. Hamas stole it. I saw Hamas terrorists carrying boxes with the UN and UNRWA emblems on them into the tunnel. Dozens and dozens of boxes, paid by your government. Feeding terrorists who tortured me and murdered my family. They would eat many meals a day from the UN aid in front of us, and we never received any of it. When you speak of humanitarian aid, remember this. Hamas eats like kings, while hostages starve. Hamas steals from civilians. Hamas blocks aid from reaching those who truly need it. 491 days. That is how long I starved. How long I was chained. How long I begged for humanity. And in all that time, no one came. And no one in Gaza helped me. No one.
Again, heavy, truly damning testimony there from Sharabi. In the face of the Security Council, he is right. This plight of Gaza has taken up a lot of air and a lot of time in that room. Again, we'll follow up on all of his doings there. We move to another story here now. Some intriguing information that comes to light from a report published in Israel Hayom amid developments in the expanding so-called Qatar Gate affair, which centers on investigations into connections between officials in Prime Minister Netanyahu's office and the Qatari government. And in line with the investigation, 2 officials from the Prime Minister's office were questioned but released. And we're here to get into the emerging details with the author of the latest report, Ariel Kahana, joining us now, diplomatic correspondent for Israel Hayom. Ariel, thanks for being with us in person. Look, I'm going to jump into some details in the article here. You described 2 incidents in particular that jumped out to me, where someone claiming to represent the Prime Minister's office seemingly intervened to suppress, anti-Qatari online content, whether it was, online campaigns for private individuals or even the IDF spokesperson himself or their office, to keep Qatar happy, essentially, useful as mediators with Hamas. How surprising were these discoveries for you? How do they tie in to, what's the term we're hearing all the time now, Qatar Gate?
So thank you for having me, David. I would just say it's not easy for all of us here in the studio to jump from
right.
Eli Sharabi testimony.
A stark shift.
Yes, definitely. So you were asking if it was surprising for me. It was not surprising, because from the first day of the war, or the first days, let's say, Israel got to the conclusion that it needs Qatar. Okay, as hard as it is, although everybody knew or discovered after the war, actually all the money, or some of the money they paid to Hamas was actually going to Hamas army. But after discussions, and I know discussions were held, the conclusion was that if we don't have Hamas, if we don't have Qatar, then nobody else will be a useful negotiator with Hamas. And therefore, the other option was Egypt, but it was not clear if Egypt would be good enough. So the decision was, although we know what Qatar is, we will cooperate. Actually, we'll even defend Qatar. Wow. So those 2 events that I described in the story, one, as you said, with IDF spokesman office, and there's the other one with some Israeli businessmen who began an X or Twitter account against Qatar with a very embarrassing pictures of the Qatari emir, right? So both of them got telephone calls from, let's call it, Prime Minister office. Yeah. One of them actually from the Mossad. And the request was, take it down. What you have against Qatar, take it down. Now it is going against Israeli interests. And again, the reason is because Israel still wants actually, a productive negotiator or mediator, I would say, for Hamas to have a hostages deal. That's the point. It's complicated.
Yeah,
but
I'm left wondering why these groups listened to these calls. I mean, look, Qatar, even if true all this, Qatar is not, unless I'm wrong, not classified as an enemy state by the state of Israel. Sort of no relations here. So it's not necessarily some sort of crime that they're engaging with Qatar, or at least going after Qatar. How scandalous? How scandalous do you feel this whole revelation is? How big of an issue, really, for the country?
So again, after October 7th, I mean, everybody had, we had some rumors about Qatar before, but after October 7th, that actually, again, it was clear that Hamas helped to build Hamas army. And on top of that, you have all what Qatar did with sponsoring universities, campuses in America, right? You combine everything together. You know that Qatar is a country that actually supports Muslim Brothers, extreme Islam, doing it in a very sophisticated way.
They're being shunned by the Egyptians, the Saudis, the Palestinian Authority for all those reasons. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But so Qatar was exposed. Let's put it this way. But again, since it's a tough decision. You know how bad they are, and still you say I have to cooperate with them for having the hostages back. So that's why the decision was to keep cooperating with them and not to embarrass them in the war.
Do you think the decision is still on the table there to keep Qatar, in the fold? I mean, the U.S. has a massive military. It's the biggest base in the region in Qatar, so they're a huge partner. We see them still involved in all the mediations recently. Is Qatar still that sort of necessary fixture for Israel in this equation, or is it being sidelined? Are they being pushed out at this point?
So the answer is yes. And I'll tell you even more, that at some point, especially after the first phase of the deal, there was an effort by the Israeli side to shift the talks back to Egypt. Oh. Because Egypt is not perfect as well, but it's better players than Qatar. But you had negotiations over there, and it failed. Yeah. So it was taken back to Doha, which tells you that, yes, if you want a deal, you probably need Qatar. Now, there is a dilemma, and you do have some experts like Yigal Kamon from Memory and others who will tell you the way to get things from Qatar is not to be nice with them, but to push them and do embarrass them. But again, the Israeli formal decision is now to defend Qatar, and at some point, after we have the hostages back, etc., hopefully, then this account is still open, but it's going to wait.
Well, certainly, it's hard to find a story related to us right now that doesn't find Qatar inserted in some way right now. So many facets, and you mentioned the U.S. University scene as well, so funded and infiltrated by Qatari interests and money at this point. Ariel Kahana, fascinating story. I know there is more to come, and we'll stay tuned for it. Thanks for being with us on that.
Thank you very much.
Tonight in the studio. Now, again, Iran is currently reviewing both the threats and opportunities presented to them in a letter from U.S. President Donald Trump, which urges Tehran to return to the negotiating table and reach an agreement. And before we discuss, though, here's more.
Iran is carefully considering a letter sent by U.S. President Donald Trump earlier this month, urging Tehran to return to nuclear talks.
This time, maximum pressure has been accompanied by diplomacy, including sending a letter and a request for negotiations. But we will not negotiate under pressure or threats. Our policy is clear.
The letter, delivered through an Emirati diplomat, has been described by U.S. officials as tough, reportedly setting a 2-month deadline and threatening consequences if Iran continues its nuclear program. However, Iran has rejected direct negotiations under what it calls Trump's bullying tactics. Trump revealed the letter's existence during an early March interview with Fox Business News, saying, "I've written them a letter saying, I hope you're going to negotiate, because if we have to go in militarily, it's going to be a terrible thing." He added, "You can't let them have a nuclear weapon." Iran's supreme leader dismissed the letter as deceptive, but Foreign Minister Araghchi confirmed that Tehran is still evaluating its response, which is expected in the coming days.
The letter is actually more of a threat, but it also claims that there are opportunities.
In his first term, Trump withdrew the U.S. from the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran, which had placed strict limits on Tehran's nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. After pulling out in 2018 and reimposing sanctions, Iran breached and far surpassed those limits, advancing its nuclear program.
We're joined by Dr. Meir Javedanfar, Iran lecturer at Reichman University. Meir, good to have you back on the show with me here, joining us from Tel Aviv. Look, the best we can decipher, President Trump now maybe steering away from an arms control deal, something we saw sort of out of the Obama era, more of a disarmament that would essentially leave the regime in Iran intact and provide the money. You know, where might these talks take things?
Well, David, welcome to the new science and art of Trumpology. We had astrology, which we try to see based on where the stars are. You know, we try to predict the future. And now we have the new science of Trumpology. Based on erratic and sometimes contradictory statements, we try to see where President Trump wants to go somewhere. Well, the one thing I have to tell you, David, about Trumpology is give up. Okay, we don't know where he's going.
We can't give up. He just started. We can't give up yet. We got to stay in this field of science.
You got to stay, but to try to see where his comments as if there are stars where they're navigating. That's what I mean. You can't. You just can't. So we just have to take it at one statement at a time of where we're going. It's very difficult to predict. This art of Trumpology has not been perfected yet. We've only just started.
We're working on it.
We don't know what he's going to do with Iran, David. We don't know what he's going to do. Today, he's saying that he wants to reach a deal. What will that deal mean? I mean, I'll take you back to his first term. He exchanged 27 letters with the North Korean leader. And at the end, they met. They were very respectful to each other. Where did that get us? It's very difficult for us to know what he wants to do, what he's going to be his end game. But what we know is that he's placing the Iranian regime under unprecedented pressure, David. Unprecedented pressure at a time when, this is also important to note, when the regime is at a very vulnerable stage.
Well, along those lines, I mean, the Iranian proxies largely defamed across the Middle East, mainly on our borders, we should mention. The Iranian airspace has proven to be open to Israeli jets. It looks like at this point, Mayor, that nuclear weapons, first of all, they've proven to be the only true staying power for any regime in the world. See Libya, see Ukraine, see Saddam Hussein. So in what reality could we expect this regime, whose central tenet is the destruction of Israel, one of them, to actually relinquish their nuclear program at this point?
Central tenet is to stay in power, David. That's the most important thing. Of course, they hate us. They hate us passionately. But not at the cost of, if it's between choosing regime survival and destroying Israel, then they would choose regime survival, which is one of the reasons why they have not made a nuclear weapon all these years. The Islamic Republic is very concerned about the fact that its hand is weak with Trump. And it's very concerned about the fact that this is also the person who walked out of the last nuclear deal. David, I was with I-24. We did so many interviews about the Iran nuclear deal. And there were some things that were said that were true, and some things that were said was scandalously untrue. And one of those scandalously untrue things was that it was easy for Khamenei to reach that deal. It was not. There was a hell of a lot of negotiations he had to do with his own factions beforehand. Although he's an enemy of the state of Israel, and if I can choose a parallel to what's going on with Hamas right now, just like Hamas kept the first, but it's part of the bargain with the first stage of the negotiations with the hostages, the Iranian regime also kept its part of the deal, and Trump walked out of the deal and then killed the apple of Ayatollah Khamenei's eyes, which was Qasem Soleimani. So Ayatollah Khamenei is standing before two very dangerous options, not just bad, David, dangerous. Either he ignores Trump and faces war, or he ignores his own people and faces one of the most, let's just say, potentially tumultuous periods in unstable periods in his regime's history. He's between these two choices. It's not an easy choice to make, especially for an 85-year-old man.
Mayor Javedanfar, a lot taking place, obviously, on this front, as always. Good to have you back on the subject.
Thank you, sir.
We have some other regional updates to bring into the studio here and discuss. certainly from the Gaza front, as we open the show tonight, discussing there's an offensive underway at this hour for the last 2 days at least now. Our IDF ground forces again making their way into various areas of the Gaza Strip. And Ariel Osran here to break down some of the latest we're hearing. What's the latest update?
Right, so if earlier today the IDF announced that it expanded its operation in the north part of the Gaza Strip, mainly Beit Hanun, now the IDF saying it has launched a ground offensive in the south, in Rafah, in the area of Shabura, saying that ground troops have already dismantled Hamas terror infrastructure, and this simultaneously, while ground forces are continuing to operate in central and northern Gaza, all the while Israeli airstrikes against Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad infrastructure, operatives, civil operatives, military commanders across the Gaza Strip. These continue to be ongoing. So really, we're seeing a simultaneous ground offensive in the north, central, and southern parts of the Gaza Strip. This is not quite what we saw at the start of the ground.
I think this is what a lot of people expected to see at the beginning of the war.
And this is what we talked about at the beginning of the broadcast, that when Israel entered Gaza on the ground, it entered from the north and worked its way downwards.
It took a long time.
Now that is not what we're seeing. We're seeing, rather than a north to south push, we're seeing an east to west push. That is what's going on, with Israeli forces also operating on the coast in northern Gaza. And if we're taking Israeli leaders for their word, this is only the beginning, with this ground operation expected to only expand.
We'll certainly stay tuned on all of that. Fortress Gaza, that was at the beginning of the war, largely dismantled at this point. So those are the gains from the first phases of this war. Now going in for the cleanup operation, it appears. We'll definitely stay tuned. Yaakov, look, I want to bring you back into the Iran equation here, as we were just talking about, and coming to how big of a factor Iran still plays over all these regional affairs. And we talk about the destruction of their proxies, not much left of the potency of what was hanging over Israel here. But with this now attention from the U.S. administration on Iran, is there a moment of desperation that we may be facing? Again, we're looking at the nuclear programs and what they might do. The Houthis firing at us. What kind of perspective should we have? Not complacency, I would argue, that this is a tame tiger in some way. What are the main concerns? How are you looking at the Iran equation right now, vis-a-vis Israel?
So I think what the Iranians want to do is to rebuild their empire in the Middle East, and they view the nuclear program as the key to doing that. It's their sort of potion of immortality that if they go nuclear or come close enough, they will feel that they're untouchable. I think that the Iranians, it's very clear by now, are utterly ideologically, religiously committed to the destruction of the state of Israel, which is why they invested endless resources into surrounding us with this ring of fire. And the next step was to create a nuclear umbrella over that. Now their ring of fire has been dismantled. They're left with the nuclear program. They view themselves becoming nuclear or very, very close as the key to starting to rebuild their regional program. And therefore, I think that they are in a real bind. They really are. We don't know how they're going to respond, but at the end of the day, we can only hope, actually, that the regime falls, because that would be the ultimate outcome, much better than even a strike on their nuclear program.
Major issue, obviously, living over all of this. Yes, Ariel, quick update?
Yeah. Look, we've been talking about external pressure on Iran, but we have to remember that there's also growing internal turmoil, with the Iranian rial hitting just
economic
in the last few hours
as well.
984,000 to the US dollar, an all-time low, approaching 1 million rial to $1 US. At the eve of the Islamic Revolution, it was 70 rial to $1 US.
Well, we'll follow this situation closely. Ariel Ozerat, Yaakov Lapin, thanks for being with us so far on all the subjects we've thrown your way. I want to bring one more at you here, viewers. Badr Khan Suri. He's a postdoctoral fellow at Georgetown Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. At least he was. He's the latest target of the Trump administration's deportations after labeling him a harm to U.S. foreign policy. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security went a little further, saying it was for his active ties to the Palestinian terror group Hamas and other activity on social media. So we get into this right now. We're joined by Michael Wilds. He's an immigration lawyer and the managing partner at Wilds & Weinberg, mayor of Inglewood, New Jersey, joining us from New York. So thank you, Mayor, for being with us. Look, while many who support Israel, many of us who support Israel may be applauding all these moves right now. But what are we to make of these moves? A crackdown on terror supporters or a potentially backfiring, PR scandal of rounding up political dissenters?
This is a clear case of free speech versus conduct. I don't consider this to be an invasion on the freedom of speech, no different than a person cannot scream fire in a theater. It is considered to be a fighting word, what is being done, and the associations in this case, it's really what is at issue. The fact is the administration is cracking down on those that would support insidious terrorism and conduct. Free speech is not at issue here. We have grown up in this century to understand that we have to deal with insidious people saying terrible things, from Nazis to KKK and so forth. But here, what you have is somebody who may be giving material support and a real association with a terrorist. Unfortunately, we don't have the information. But so long as we have due process and we are assured that they are in breach of their visa or their green card, unless they have the golden grail of a U.S. passport, they can be removed from America.
Look, this White House is talking and acting very differently towards the spectacle of Israel hate so prominent across America. Do you think we're going to see some effect or, change in the tone from the top on national discourse?
Absolutely. The tone is changing. I can tell you from my perspective, I'm a former federal prosecutor, a mayor, and an immigration lawyer. I'm a second-generation immigration lawyer. My father did the green card for John Lennon and a lot of other wonderful people. We have a very good sense that this is now like a five-alarm fire dealing with the immigration authorities as they weed out the bad people. The good people will stay. And unfortunately, they're going to be theaters of challenge in the courts, and the government will be over-aggressive, and we have to be smart about it. But from way on high, they're serious about what they're doing, and they're going to make sure, number one, Am Yisrael Chai, and number two, that those that would want to cause America or Israel harm are treated under law.
Mayor Michael Wilds, thank you for being with us here from the U.S. Thanks for joining.
My pleasure.
Unfortunately, we run out of time here for all the slew of updates we try to bring your way in the hour we're given here on The Rundown. Thanks for joining us now. Of course, you can follow all the latest updates on the 5 different active fronts now facing Israel. Again, we've tried to detail them all for you here and all the updates. Stay tuned here on I-24 News. Throughout the day and night, we'll always have the updates for you. For now, I'm David Matlin, coming to you live from Tel Aviv, wherever you are in the world. Thanks for joining.
Introducing the brand new I-24 News Video On Demand app. You'll have instant access to all our programs, reports, in-depth discussions and expert commentary, all at your fingertips, whenever you want it. So what are you waiting for? Download the I-24 News Video On Demand app today. The 7th of October set in motion a chain of events. Today, Israel's enemies are severely weakened, but not defeated, and the balance of power is shifting. This region never rests.
And for its own survival, Israel needs to keep its finger on the pulse. If you want to better understand, if you want to hear voices you won't hear elsewhere, then tune in daily to Middle East Now on i24 News.
Want to stay on top of the news no matter where you are? Introducing i24 News' brand new news website. On our website, you'll find all the latest articles, interviews, and live broadcasts. Everything you need to know right at your fingertips, whenever you want it. So what are you waiting for? Download the i24 News app today.
Hello and welcome to Middle East Now. These are tonight's headlines. Ceasefire ceased for the first time in 6 months. Rockets launched from Gaza towards central Israel as the IDF expands its ground operation in the Strip. Sticks, carrots, and ultimatums. Trump's nuclear letter to Iran. It's either my way or the highway. And opposing the opposition, another day of mass protest in Istanbul as Erdogan's political rival, the mayor, detained. We begin here in Israel, where the cease of the ceasefire continues. The IDF expanding its ground operation today, sending troops into northern Gaza, the latest move in what seems to be an increasing campaign there. So before we unpack the meaning of it all, here's a recap of the third day of the return to the Strip. Our Alexander Schloss reports.
Sirens blared across central Israel, triggered by 3 rockets fired from Gaza, and the first such attack emanating from the Gaza Strip in 2 months. And the first since the ceasefire reached in January collapsed on Monday night. Meanwhile, Israel continued its bombardment of Gaza into its 3rd day, with Palestinians reporting at least 85 killed in the latest slew of airstrikes. The IDF also announced it has intensified its ground operations, sending land forces into Beit Lahia and the coastal areas of northern Gaza, following Wednesday's announcement that IDF tanks had entered the Netzarim corridor, bisecting the Gaza Strip from north to south. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that future negotiations will only take place under fire, while Hamas says it will only release the remaining hostages in exchange for a lasting ceasefire and a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. So, as the ceasefire fades and fighting escalates, the prospects of a diplomatic breakthrough to free the remaining hostages seems to be diminishing.
So for the latest, we want to turn now to I-24 News correspondent Robert Swift there on the ground. Robert, for the first time in nearly 6 months, missiles launched from Gaza towards central Israel, sirens sending Israelis back to shelters, and that comes after a Houthi launch overnight. History has a tendency to repeat itself, but that was quite quick.
Yeah, indeed, we're right back there. To a certain extent, with the launch from Hamas on the Gaza Strip, I think that was understood. It was likely following the ceasefire that's given Hamas a bit of time to prepare themselves for such things. The IDF will hope that the intensity of airstrikes that it's conducting will mean that Hamas only have a very short window where they maintain that capability. That's what we've seen in the past, and it's likely what will happen again here. And the IDF have been conducting airstrikes throughout the Gaza Strip. We've seen one here firsthand, quite close to the Israeli town of Sderot, where Israeli jets were striking a target just on the other side inside Gaza. The IDF have announced a string of different individuals, mostly in Hamas, but also a couple in Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who have been killed in the last 24 hours. The most recent, Osama Tabash, was said to be in charge of Hamas's targeting. Now, as we've heard in the report, whilst these attacks from the air are taking place, the IDF is also inserting ground troops. Netzarim corridor in the centre, that's probably the most pivotal area where the IDF are likely to make quite rapid ground due to the fact that this is an open road that they had previously built. Their troops are advancing in that location at the moment. But up here in the north of the Gaza Strip, Beit Lahia, also troops inserting there. That location, they're reported by the IDF to have been moving close to the coastal access. But as we've also seen, the location from where the rockets that were launched towards Tel Aviv earlier today, that location has been ordered to evacuate, so that could be a possible sign that the IDF intends to operate down there too.
So, Robert, to touch on that point exactly, many of our viewers are wondering how come after all of the operations that we've seen, after this renewed operation that we're seeing now, how come Hamas still has the ability to launch rockets towards Israel?
Look, these are pretty primitive rockets. In the time that the ceasefire was taking place, of course, both sides were preparing for the fighting to take place again. Likely Hamas have done exactly that with their rockets. I would suspect that Hamas has placed rockets around different parts of the Gaza Strip, and in the future coming days we may see additional launches in this manner. As I said before, this will be a key priority for the IDF to target it from the air, and so it's unclear if Hamas will be able to keep up that capability for particularly long. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that sirens will stop inside the center of Israel. There's always the Houthis as well.
Yes, indeed, there are always the Houthis, and we will, of course, expand on that further later on in the show. Thank you very much, Robert Swift, for this. And now to get a more in-depth look into both the military campaign and perhaps the diplomatic means that are to be achieved through it, security analyst Yaakov Lapin and a former Europe and Middle East editor for the Associated Press, Dan Perry, are joining us here in the studio. Thank you both very much for joining us, gentlemen. So, Mr. Lapin, I do want to begin with you. When it comes to the military campaign, to the IDF operations on the ground, what should be done? What is being done? You know what? Let's begin with that, perhaps.
So what began with a very intense air campaign targeting, remarkably, the members of Hamas's political regime. And this comes on the back of an extensive period in which aid trucks were not being let in. So I think, first of all, we're seeing Israel targeting Hamas's political regime because the aid was being hijacked by the political regime. And these internal security and so-called prime minister of Gaza, who were eliminated in the first minutes of this resumed strike campaign, they were all part of Hamas's efforts to rebuild its regime in Gaza. So that is very significant.
So if I'm writing down bullet points to be discussed later with Dan Perry here, first bullet point, disrupting Hamas's ability to rule underground.
To rule on the ground, exactly right.
All right.
And then we're seeing the usual targets, which is rocket launchers and the other, military wing targets, the terrorist targets of Hamas. Now we're seeing a phased ground offensive underway. Israel has already basically seized the Netzarim corridor anew after leaving it as part of stage 1. And we're seeing more and more of Gaza is going to start coming under Israeli military control. My hunch is that this time, unlike the past rounds, the IDF is not going to be going in and out. What it seizes, it's going to stay in.
So bullet point number 2, retrieving, if you will, some of the sticks that Israel compromised by leaving the territory.
All right, putting Hamas under serious pressure and basically demanding that it comes back to the negotiation table and relinquishes its demand for a stage 2, which was a demand for the IDF to completely leave the Gaza Strip and let Hamas, realign itself on the border and take Philadelphia on the border with Egypt. Right. All of these things have been rejected by the Israeli government, and we're seeing the exact opposite happening on the ground. So Hamas basically has 2 choices. It can either continue to barricade itself into its current position and lose more and more control over Gaza as time goes by, or it can press pause on this entire situation and agree to release more living hostages. Those are the 2 options that Israel has given Hamas at this time.
So, connecting the dots here, we have collected bullet points for you to make sense out of them, Mr. Dan Perry.
The critical difference between now and before the ceasefire is that the U.S. is run by Donald Trump and not Joe Biden, and therefore there are effectively no constraints, no guardrails on what Israel can do. Israel can assume that provision of weaponry will continue almost no matter what occurs on the ground. Israel can assume that the most ambitious plans for Gaza would be entertained, things that would have been vetoed essentially by Biden. So that gives Israel tremendously wide berth as to what it might do. And the way things are looking right now, because Yaakov is so right, that it is likely that the paradigm will change and areas they will take, they will keep. And because the government continues to entertain no option to Hamas in Gaza, PA or whatever else, the implication is that what we're looking at, if this operation is successful, is a prolonged Israeli military and civilian administration of Gaza. But that's what appears to be the end game here.
Not dismissing the importance of discussing the end game here, and yet, if we're just looking at the past 2 weeks, we essentially had a ceasefire intact, and yet zero release of hostages, zero movement, or positive dynamics, let's call it that way, in the around the negotiating table. On the contrary, so something had to give, something had to be done in order to break this deadlock.
Also, something has to be said, which is that even though ending the war with Hamas remaining in power is in itself a horrible outcome, not just for Israel, but for the region, the world, and for the Palestinians, it is nonetheless the implied outcome of the deal, as I read it, that Israel signed under duress, under pressure by Trump, in January. Israel is walking away from the deal it signed because the government was never comfortable with it, and because the very person who forced them to sign is now allowing them to walk away.
Trump administration itself said it was not feeling comfortable with the Biden outline. They just said, we need to move forward, so sign this and we'll talk about it later.
And look, in the old polite world, if you sign a deal, under whatever circumstances you're expected to keep it.
Deals are meant to be broken, some will suggest.
Is a world where a negotiated deal is just the beginning point of the next negotiation.
But militarily speaking, what could be the next phase of this current campaign?
I think we're going to see more and more, first of all, Gazan civilians being pushed back to al-Mawasi, to that humanitarian area as time goes by. Now we're seeing Gaza split again between north and south. And it looks like the more time goes by, the more the Israeli-controlled part of Gaza will grow. And as that happens, I expect Israel to try and push more and more of the civilians to the al-Mawasi area. It obviously has to tailor these operations, both aerial and ground operations, in a way that takes into account the location of every single one of the 24 living hostages, which we can assume are very much marked out and flagged on every operational map that the Israeli Air Force or the ground forces or the Navy are using. So that's another thing to keep in mind. But I think that this is a phased plan that is only going to increase unless or until Hamas decides to change the terms of its demands going forward.
Yes, and not circling back to this policy of rounds, but rather a more distinct act here. Well, we're talking about the remaining hostages, and we cannot not go now to this. The man with the truly superhuman powers, freed hostage, Ali Sharabi, is traveling the world ever since he got out of hell in order to bring back his brothers who are still there in captivity. He arrived today at the place where they just, they didn't want to listen, they didn't want to hear, they didn't want to see the UN. So today, he arrived there, so they must see, they must listen to him.
I know that you discuss the humanitarian situation in Gaza very often. But let me tell you, as an eyewitness, I saw what happened to that aid. Hamas stole it. I saw Hamas terrorists carrying boxes with the UN and UNRWA emblems on them into the tunnel. Dozens and dozens of boxes, paid by your government. Feeding terrorists who tortured me and murdered my family. They would eat many meals a day from the UN aid in front of us, and we never received any of it.
No, there are truly no words to describe the spirit and the impact and the power of this man. And what he says, it echoes, it resonates, and it should be heard right there at the UN Security Council.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I hear some people speaking, I think naively, about whether this will convince the ambassadors. It's not about the ambassadors, who are just representatives of governments, but rather about public opinion around the world. I have felt throughout that Israel has had, despite everything, the moral high ground, given what happened on October 7th, and the inadmissibility of maintaining the status quo ante, but hasn't done much with public diplomacy. This is public diplomacy. The man is sympathetic, clearly not a professional propagandist, had endured the most vile treatment conceivable, and is a credible narrator, basically.
But you know what, I would
and
like
also,
to,
the fact that he's a former hostage, I hate to put it in such crass terms, makes him right now a global celebrity.
Yeah.
So to bring him out there and to have him speak, and the way he speaks, and the sympathetic nature of his delivery, I think is effective.
Yeah, and we've seen President Trump's reaction to Ali Sharabi and the rest of the delegation of hostages arriving there at the White House. And I would like to pick your brain on that because, we're speaking here and we are watched abroad. But here in Israel, there is this debate on whether hostage diplomacy, quote unquote, whatever cynical, ridiculous term, comes to assist proper diplomacy or replace it. And I think it's both. It's not either or. It's both.
The other.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. All right. And when we're talking about the momentum, we already, the IDF gets to begin its new campaign. We already hear condemnations. We're not too surprised by it. And yet, what's the leeway here internationally in terms of the IDF's ability to operate?
Well, as Dan said at the beginning of our conversation, Israel has got full support from this new White House for a continued military operation. That is really the only thing I think that counts in terms of pressure, external pressure, or lack of it. This is a total change from the situation that we had under the Biden administration. And so, what can the other countries do? You've got Britain and France condemning the operation. I don't think that's going to make any dent in the government's calculations. The weapons come from the United States. The veto at the UN Security Council comes from the United States. This is Israel's main strategic superpower ally. If the U.S. is on board, then Israel feels comfortable, the Israeli government feels comfortable to proceed with its plans.
And yet, in terms of military orders, there is no such order as all hell breaks loose. Like, there needs to be a literal translation of this policy this leeway Israel is receiving from Washington in practical terms.
100%. I mean, we're talking about the idea of continuing operations in the same manner that it was pursuing them in terms of targeting, not in terms of seizing territory, which we said will probably be different, but it's the same target selection process. It's the same attempt to avoid civilian casualties, despite Hamas's embedding its targets in the middle of every civilian infrastructure that we can imagine. None of that has changed. None of that will change. This is how the IDF operates.
Right, right. Well, amidst it all, you're staying here with us, Mr. Lepp and Mr. Perry. The Saudis are perhaps reviving their peace plan. Well, according to French President Emmanuel Macron, he spoke with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and saying that they will be co-chairing a conference on a two-state solution. Yes, in the same spirit, Macron is saying that he's welcoming the MVS Ukraine peace negotiations. So for more on that, we want to turn now to geopolitical analyst, Mr. Gerard Vespierre. Thank you very much, Mr. Vespierre, for your time. Well, we appreciate it. Thank you. So it sounds like it is more wishful than thinking here, isn't it?
Well, maybe there is a difference between wishful thinking and a lot of wishes.
Precisely.
The two-state solution, is supported by China. The two-state solution is supported by Russia. The two-state solution is supported by a small group of people, European Union, and a smaller group of people, United Nations. So, there is really a problem that step by step, whatever the end solution would be, but have to be worked on.
Right. So in the greater scheme of things, if you will, isn't it more likely that Mohammed bin Salman gets hands-on under American auspices and not in collaboration with Paris if and when it decides to join, an endgame here in the conflict?
So the root arguments from Saudi Arabia going further with the Abraham Accords is to look at a two-state solution. They have been reaffirming that position for now 2 years. So really that's something which need to be handled one way or the other. And I think that ultimately there will be negotiations, and again, whatever the solutions or the end of the negotiation might be between Israel and Saudi Arabia. But this is the strategy of the small steps from Henry Kissinger. We have to proceed.
So, Mr. Vespierre, from the French standpoint, do you think that this French attempt to gain some diplomatic clout, let's put it that way, comes against the backdrop of its relative, I think it would be fair to say, failure to be the main broker when it comes to Israel and Lebanon?
We are not claiming the position that you're claiming for us. We are not claiming to be the main broker. We are only saying that we have a place there and we want to participate. We have soldiers in Lebanon, we have soldiers in Jordan, we have soldiers in the United Emirates. So we are involved in the Middle East. We are contributing to our place, not more, not less.
So, Mr. Vespierre, what would be the next step? What should we look out for?
Well, I've been anticipating that a little bit, mentioning the potential discussion between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Here is certainly one of the crossroads of that question.
Mr. Gerard Vespierre, geopolitical analyst, thank you very much for your time, for your insight. We appreciate it. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you for the call.
So zooming in now back into what is happening in Israel domestically, another day of protest in the streets of Jerusalem. You're seeing now the visuals of that on-screen violent protest against the government's intention to sack the head of the Shin Bet Internal Security Agency, Ronen Bar. Those protests, including the scene you're seeing right now, in which the leader of the Democrats Party, Yair Golan, was tossed on the ground. So we want to turn now to I-24 News diplomatic affairs correspondent Valir Sladin, being there all day long in the streets of Jerusalem, the feisty streets of Jerusalem. So what is the current state of affairs? The government is convening later on tonight to ratify, to approve the firing of the Shin Bet chief, right?
Yes, exactly. In a few hours from now, the Israeli government will vote on firing the chief of the head of the Shin Bet, Ronen Bar today. Of course, it is expected that this is gonna go through unanimously. Everyone's gonna vote for it, and this is happening while here today. It started since this morning. The protests that were also on the streets, that made their way, the protesters, through the streets of Jerusalem to the Prime Minister's residence here in central Jerusalem. And there were a lot of clashes, of course, between the protesters and the policemen here. Even in one incident, one of the policemen pushed the head of the opposition party, the Democrat, Yair Golan. He fell on the ground. This incident, of course, drove a lot of condemnation from the head of the opposition, Yair Lapid, that accused the police of following the orders of Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Minister of National Security, and he called on investigating this incident. Yair Golan himself said that he's fine, and he's going to continue with his process in opposition, of course, for the latest developments, for the moves, the decisions that this government has taken.
I-24 News diplomatic affairs correspondent Balir Sladin, of course, keeping close tabs on this government session later on tonight. Thank you very much for this, Balir. Gentlemen, there's much talk on the legal element here and the element or the layer of legitimacy. It all comes down to trust or lack thereof at the end of the day.
Yeah. No Shin Bet chief has ever been fired in Israel. This would be unprecedented.
Well, no October 7th ever happened in Israel.
Indeed. Look, it must be said, the Shin Bet failed spectacularly on October 7th. But on the other hand, in their own internal inquiry that was published and leaked in recent weeks and months, they sort of admit to that, but also claim that there are warnings that the schism in Israel caused by the current government with its judicial overhaul was going to lead to an attack, and that was ignored.
But this all goes back to the finger-pointing discourse. And there is a basic question we can discuss, and we will be discussing the how, but the what. The fact that the head of the Shin Bet needs to conclude his term.
This is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
He has said he would go, and the government can fire him. Absolutely. But there's a procedure in Israel for how to fire the head of the Shin Bet. And that procedure involves some sort of a review of the reasons for it and for going through the steps that are necessary. And one reason for firing Shin Bet cannot be that he no longer is liked or trusted by the Prime Minister. He is not a personal appointment of the Prime Minister. So there's an inelegance about this that creates what the Attorney General called the suspicion of illegality, a conflict of interest, because we must not forget that the man who's about to be fired probably tonight is also leading the agency that is investigating the Prime Minister's office.
And yet the Supreme Court is telling the Attorney General, you have nothing to do with approving or disapproving this.
Well, and moreover, the Attorney General that's trying to block this is herself en route to being fired. So this is a blowing up of the entire Israeli
culmination of
internal gatekeepers system that is in place for a reason. Because in Israel's brittle democracy, there's a need for these gatekeepers to prevent the country from sliding into authoritarianism, and to do this during the escalation of a major military conflict is problematic.
One side saying, yay, democracy. One side saying, end of democracy. There's no middle here.
Look, the breakdown of trust here between the Shin Bet and the government is obviously bad for Israel, bad for security, bad for society. There have to be better ways to manage fundamental disagreements between the political echelon and the head of the Domestic Intelligence Agency. Now, it's important to point out, one of the things that really saddens me is that when we talk about the Shin Bet, and it has become a conversation that's political.
Right, the Shin Bet is a shadow organization.
I think this is tragic. Let's remember, the Shin Bet is the organization that saves so many lives every month, prevents so many terror attacks. This is what it's there to do. This is what it does day in and day out. So,
and in a clandestine fashion, not such a public manner.
And we don't hear about these successes, but that's what enables us to actually live here, basically, the Shin Bet. So,
and on that